Hi, everybody. It's Mr. Beard, and I'm up here in wild, wonderful West Virginia. And it's the end of August. And guess what? You may not notice it up here because there's a lot of trees, but birds are starting to migrate. And that's what we're here to talk about today is migration. Now, when you see something like this, it's obvious. Oh my God, look at that. That's migration right there when you see these huge flocks. These are a bunch of snow geese that are flocking. And they're migrating together, and they migrate in the millions. But so do the songbirds, and so do a lot of other birds, but we just don't notice them because they don't fly in these huge concentrated flocks. Now, every year, thousands of species and billions, I mean billions of birds migrate. Why? Why go through all that trouble? Why would you do this? Well, one thing is to avoid the stress of unfavorable weather and a lack of food. If you're a bird that lives up in the Arctic during the summertime, you don't want to be there in the wintertime. There's just not much to eat. But a lot of our birds will actually come up from the tropics and they'll go to the Arctic to breed. Now, why would you bother to leave someplace that's as rich in biomass as the tropics? Well, because first of all, the food there is very abundant in the summertime. It's really abundant and concentrated because the insects, they come out and they don't have very much time to breed, so they come out all at one time because the summers are very short. And so if you've ever seen pictures of the Arctic, it's just amazing to see how many insects are out. And plus the days are longer. You get above the Arctic Circle, it's 24 hours of daylight, so birds can feed their young constantly. So by leaving the tropics, it reduces competition. They go up north where there's not as much competition for the food. So I told you there's a lot of insects. Here's somebody walking across the tundra, and you can just see the mosquitoes that are flocking behind him. It's amazing to see how many insects are up there. Again, it's the season's short for them, so they have to come out and do what they have to do in a very short time. Here are some researchers up north, and you can see they're wearing head nets to be able to avoid those insects. Now, where do they migrate? Well, they migrate in these paths that we call flyways. And those flyways are following what we call leading edges. They're following certain things like we have the Atlantic Flyway, and birds were following the coastline over there of the Atlantic Ocean. The Mississippi Flyway, they're following the Mississippi River. The Central Flyway, they're following the Rocky Mountains. And the Pacific, they're using the mountains and the Pacific Ocean as their guide. But they pretty much stick to these flyways. So how do they know where they're going? Well, one thing they're going to use is topographic landmarks. They're going to use rivers, they're going to use oceans, they're going to use mountains. So when you go to the mountains, and here's a picture of the Appalachian Mountains, you may not see that really, okay, how do they use the mountains? That doesn't make much sense. But when you look from space, all of a sudden it does make sense. This is from the space station, and you're looking down at the Appalachian Mountains. And when you look at them, you're going to notice those ridges running right down in a northeast to southwest direction. They're going to use those mountains to direct them to the tropics. Why do they use it? Well, because we have these prevailing winds. And prevailing winds actually, in a way, are a topographic feature too. And our prevailing winds are what we call the westerlies in our part of the world. And so the birds are going to fly with the wind at their back, and they're going to get to the Appalachian Mountains. And when they get to the Appalachian Mountains, there's going to be a lot of uplift, and then they can come right down the Appalachian Mountains and without having to exert much energy. So what else besides topographic landmarks? Well, stars. Birds follow stars. Now you may say, how in the world do we know that birds follow stars? Well, there was a gentleman who was a professor at Cornell University by the name of Stephen Emlen. And what he did is he came up with this ingenious method of making a large funnel, lining it with white paper, putting an ink pad in the bottom, putting a screen on top to keep the bird in, and he would put an indigo bunting in there. And he had this whole setup in a planetarium on campus. And so in a planetarium, they shine the night sky up on the roof to mimic what it's like to be outside. And when they did this, this bird who was agitated because hormones told him it was time for him to migrate would try to get out, and it would hit the screen, fall back down, hit its feet on the ink pad, try to go back out again. And when it was all done, he had a little footprints all over this white paper. But the interesting thing was the footprints were only in one direction. So then he puts a fresh piece of paper in there. He changes the planetarium lights, and lo and behold, when he puts the bird back in there, the bird takes off in the same direction according to the stars, and it's always focused in the same direction. And that's how we discovered that they follow stars. Birds also use the sun for direction if you're a daytime migrant. Some birds use Earth's magnetic field, they can sense it. And some birds, when they get close enough to where they're trying to go to, can actually sense odors. Now, there are three types of migration we see in birds: complete, partial, and eruptive. And we're going to look at each one of these. First, we have complete migration. And in complete migration, all birds of a species leave the breeding range during the non-breeding season. Examples of birds that do this would be shorebirds like sandpipers, warblers, flycatchers, vireos, hummingbirds, orioles like this Baltimore oriole you see here, and some of the raptor species like Swainson's hawks and broadwing hawks. So here's a map of the range of a wood thrush, and a wood thrush is a complete migrant. And you can see there's different colors here. Brown represents the summer breeding range. Winter is the non-breeding range. Yellow is what you see in migration. And you see that there's no place that they live year-round. So you have these two distinctive areas. You have the breeding range and the non-breeding range, and they don't overlap. So that's a complete migrant. The next one is partial migration, which this flicker you see in this picture is a bird that does partial migration. Partial migration is when you have seasonal movements away from the breeding range by some, but not all members of the species. And they move, but they don't move the same distances. A lot of times it's a male-female thing. So when you look at the map of the range for these species, there's going to be overlap between the breeding and the non-breeding range. And this is probably the most common type of migration we see in North America. So examples of partial migrants would be things like sparrows, woodpeckers like the northern flicker above, blue jays, gulls like laughing gull and ring-billed gull, crows, and some of the raptor species like sharp-shinned hawks, Cooper's hawks, and red-tailed hawks. So here we have the range of a wood duck who's a partial migrant. And you can see now that there is the brown part where wood ducks would only be found in the summer during breeding. And then you have this purple range, this kind of lavender range, and that's where you would see wood ducks only in the winter. But then you have this range in between where you could see wood ducks year-round. So you have this overlap, and I demonstrated this with these circles. So you can see there is places where you can see a wood duck in the summer, and there's where you could see them in the winter. And so you have that overlap range right there. The last one is eruptive migration. And you can see here's a picture of evening grosbeak. And evening grosbeaks, very, very seldom do you see them in Virginia. But once in a blue moon, there are years when they suddenly show up and you see them. And so that's the nature of an eruptive migration. They're seasonal or geographically unpredictable. We don't know when they're going to happen, though we can kind of guess. So it doesn't occur every year like the other migrants. You typically see it with food specialists, and why this works this way is because some years we have a really good seed crop, and so birds that eat fir and spruce seeds, they'll stay up in the north where there's plenty of food. But some years we have bad seed crops, and those are the years that they come down south trying to find food. So some examples of eruptive migrants are things like the great gray owl, red crossbills, who have this interesting crossbill that allows them to eat seeds out of a pine cone, pine siskin, evening grosbeaks, red-breasted nuthatches. So really, really interesting birds. So get out there and observe migration. It's an amazing thing. It just, to me, it's one of the most amazing things. I mean, I'm sitting up here in West Virginia and the birds are migrating now. Birds I saw last week, I don't see this week because they've already started moving towards the tropics. And it's something, you can find birds migrating every month of the year and they migrate back and forth. It's just amazing. And what's even more amazing is a bird that is nesting in my yard, who's a migrant, will fly to the tropics, maybe all the way to Colombia or Peru, and it'll spend the winter down there in the same place year after year. And it comes all the way back here to my yard and nest, maybe even in the same tree. No road map, no Google Maps telling it how to do it. It's amazing. There is nothing in the world quite like migration. It is one of the most amazing events to observe. Get outside, watch it happen, enjoy. Take care.